I'm going to be taking up one of the themes that Lyndon LaRouche has been discussing recently, because it's, number one, we're seeing the most pathetic presidential campaign in the history of this country. It makes hee-haw look elevated. Those of you who are older remember that rotten television show. I mean, there's no substance whatsoever in the presidential race, and it's getting worse with the whole question of, I mean, imagine how interested could people be in Ted Cruz's sex life? I mean, if that's not an oxymoron, I don't know what is. It's hard to imagine that he could reproduce. But in any case, you've got a terrible presidential campaign, but the presidential campaign reflects a problem in the culture, which is that people seem to have difficulties thinking, putting ideas together. And therefore, they're willing to accept the idea that we're going to have a presidential campaign about nothing, and we have to choose the lesser evil. Now, if you just think about that, what does it mean to choose the lesser evil? It means you're choosing something evil. Now, we're in a bubble where we have a bunch of bad candidates. We have a tremendous global strategic crisis with the danger of war from the Obama policy towards Russia and China, and the British policy, it should be said. Obama's carrying it out. But this is the old British geopolitical imperial strategy, the so-called Asia pivot, where we're threatening now the Chinese by saying that they're building an air base on an island, extending the island further into the ocean, represents a strategic threat against the United States. How is that a threat against the United States? And we're actually challenging them by going inside their 12-mile limit, by going over their airspace. And then you look at the fact that we've just had a very successful meeting between John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, which included time with Putin, where they discussed how do we take the progress that's been made in Syria, both in fighting the terrorists, the cooperation to fight terrorists, but also to create a stable, livable situation that will put an end to the refugee crisis. How do we build on that? And Kerry said, look, we have made progress and we need to build on it. Now, at the same time, while we're acknowledging that Putin's intervention, by we, I mean Obama and Kerry especially, I don't know about Obama, but acknowledging that Putin's intervention into Syria 6 months ago changed the situation there, started turning around the terrorist move to control a larger area as an Islamic caliphate. That's been reversed. ISIS is on the run. Al-Qaeda is on the run. Now, instead of building on that, and then secondly, recognizing that Russia has abided by the Minsk II agreement to end the problem over Ukraine, which was started by what? A US-backed neocon coup against the democratically elected government in Ukraine. So why is it that when Kerry is engaging in these very sensitive and important negotiations, that Obama 2 weeks ago signed a statement extending the sanctions against Russia? And then just to amplify the point, the Russian comments about what happened in Brussels were very much to the point. One of the Russian spokesmen mentioned that Stoltenberg, who's the head of NATO, who's been organizing a move of troops, NATO troops, to the border of Russia, further eastward to the border of Russia, who's been chastising NATO countries for not spending enough on defense. Stoltenberg is in Brussels, that's the capital of NATO, where we had this horrific 2 attacks at the airport and the train station the other day. Now, while this is going on, what's the US doing? Warning about the imaginary threat from Russia in the east. And as a Russian commentator, I think a spokesman for Putin, said, that Stoltenberg should be more worried about what happened under his nose in Brussels than running around looking for imaginary Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. And even more pointed was the spokesman for the foreign ministry, Zakharova, who said that if you support terrorists in one part of the world, don't be surprised if they turn up in your neighborhood. So we're in a situation now where you have this kind of crisis and potential to get out of it. And this is something that should be discussed with the American people. Are we conducting a war against ISIS, a war on terror, or is it phony? As it was proven to be phony when the Russians moved in and showed in 6 months tangible results when we'd been bombing for a year and ISIS had been expanding its territory. The war on terror was a phony from the beginning. There are terror cells running around in Belgium that the Belgian authorities knew about. They had the names. They had the addresses of the people involved in the terror attacks last week, and they did nothing to bring them in. So shouldn't these things be discussed? That's the real issue that I want to get to today. Why is it that the American people are tolerating the stupidest political campaign in history? And I don't know if it's in history. I've been following politics since 1958, 59. I actually was taken by my mother to go out and hand out brochures for John Kennedy in West Virginia in 1960. So I trace my political life back to 1960. There's never been a campaign this bad. I mean, Bush Sr. going after Dukakis for looking like a squirrel in a tank, was mild. The Willie Horton thing was mild compared to what we're seeing today. So why do we tolerate that? And that gets to the question of who actually controls the way people think in this country. Now, most Americans will naively tell you that what controls the way people think is the media. And the media is terrible. There's no question about that. And people submit to watching stupid television and stupid commentators and news reports that are not news. I mean, I don't know if you've seen it, but the last 2 days, the only thing on CNN has been what happened in Brussels, interviewing the same so-called counter-terrorist experts, making the same comments over and over and over. Now, Fox breaks into that once in a while to talk about whether Ted Cruz had sex with 5 women. I don't know if it was at the same time or what. If it was 5 women, then maybe Donald Trump would be impressed. But there's no discussion of Kerry and Lavrov, the Secretary of State meeting with the Russian foreign minister to talk about whether we're going to take the gains made against ISIS and Al-Qaeda to a full victory or not. No discussion of that. Now, the media is controlled, it is corrupt, but there's another factor here that people have to think about, which is why people are so focused on having opinions that are popular, why public opinion is shaped, why people allow or accept the idea that their opinions are going to come from know-nothing media types. And you choose between Rush Limbaugh or Chris Matthews, but that you have a left, right, they're all talking about the same thing, they have a different take on it. But there's no one who's really talking about the issues that are going to determine your future. Now, Lynn has gone back in talking about this to the death of Franklin Roosevelt. And there was a key figure at the time of Roosevelt named Walter Lippmann. And Lippmann wrote a number of books about how you can control public opinion. And this actually takes us beyond just this popular opinion idea of Lippmann. It goes back to Bertrand Russell, who essentially argued that you can't know truth. In the classic Aristotelian argument, the truth is beyond our capabilities. We can know relationships, we can know connections, we can connect dots, we can see action, counter-reaction. But in terms of actually understanding those things which are causal, those principles which determine events, we can't know them. And so the question then is, who controls the narrative? And this is essentially what Russell was involved in Russell's attacks on the great scientists of the late 19th and 20th century. So what we're dealing with is a much deeper problem than media control, because the people who you see on the media have been brainwashed into this way of thinking. There are two aspects to it. One is you attack philosophically the idea that truth is knowable, the idea that we're never going to know fully the truth of how this universe works, but we can get increasingly close to it. And that's the function of science, that's the function of philosophy. And that education is about equipping every child with the potential of critical thinking so that they can reject those truths that everyone has accepted when they find anomalies. That is, when there's something which goes outside of an accepted truth. How do you deal with it? Do you just say that's an exception? You know, in the US, there's this statement that always bugs me, the exception that proves the rule. Well, it comes from a Latin phrase where it's the exception that tests the rule, probat. That doesn't mean proves, that means tests. So when you find something that goes outside of what you think you know, that's where you start to say, okay, let's challenge what we think we know and find out if there's some higher order that can answer what this exception is, as well as explain everything else that we already think we know. But at this point, the idea is that you teach people to pass multiple choice tests. And as LaRouche said, any multiple choice test that could be given to someone like George W. Bush that he could pass does not indicate intelligence. It indicates an ability to memorize in a rote form the answers that are given. So there is this philosophical attack on real scientific method. And we've been discussing that a lot, especially in regards to the importance of the space program. Because when you start getting out into the frontiers of our universe, you find more exceptions, more anomalies, things that can't be explained by what we think we know. Newtonian mechanics goes out the window at that point. And so you've got to seek higher methods or higher means of explaining what you think you know. But there's another side to how you control people. And that is through the use of fear, terrorizing, convincing people that if they try to go outside of what's accepted, they could lose their job, they could lose their family, they could lose money, they could go to jail. And that's what I want to focus on for the next few minutes. The role of the Federal Bureau of Investigation as an internal policing agency, which is not about catching bad guys, but about terrorizing people who might move outside of the box. Now, the best way to look at this, I mean, I could go through a history of Hoover. There's no reason to. There's plenty of books out there. You know, a cross-dressing FBI chief, who one of his key focus points is to go after homosexuals. You know, that in itself tells you that the guy is a hypocrite. A top-level Southern Freemason racist, as Hoover was. There are all sorts of things. Go read the books. There are plenty of good books about what a corrupt, immoral slime this guy was, and how he used the media to create this image of the FBI as the good guys going after the bad guys. You know, with the key example being Al Capone and the Chicago mob. Now, if the FBI was so good, how come there was a Chicago mob then and there's still a Chicago mob now? How could they move from what they were doing then, which was Prohibition era, bringing in booze, to the point now that they can control drug trafficking, casinos, legitimate businesses, that they're integrated into Wall Street and the junk bond markets by Michael Milken, and then later into the derivative markets. So the FBI didn't do a very good job. How come the FBI and other government agencies can't find people to put in jail for the swindles that led to the 2008 collapse, who are doing the same thing that led to the collapse in 2008, only bigger today? So the idea of the FBI is a bunch of serious, well-meaning, straight arrows who are out there to protect you. Well, there probably are a few people like that in the FBI. They probably don't get promoted. What gets promoted are the people who know how to play the game. And what's the game? You take a case study that I did a lot of work on back in 2004 of what the FBI did to control Hollywood. Because Hollywood is a key part of shaping public opinion. But it was the way they attacked the people who had ideas in this country, who were fighting for something different, that led to the Hollywood we know today, which is the dream factory, the creation of the sagas and stories and legends that control the way people think. Now, to look at this, again, LaRouche pointed to the death of Franklin Roosevelt in early 1945 and his replacement by Harry Truman as a turning point. Because Truman was incapable of conducting the presidency. He learned nothing from FDR. He wasn't around FDR very much. But he was very heavily influenced by the British Empire, and particularly by Winston Churchill and the Churchillian allies who were in the United States government at that time. Now, what was done after World War II to reverse the Franklin Roosevelt direction was largely orchestrated by Winston Churchill. And it was Churchill who in March 1946 came to the United States when there was still a memory of Roosevelt, and Roosevelt talking about post-war reconstruction. We had a new financial system in place called the Bretton Woods system, which was put in place to allow nations to develop, to control speculation, but to create an environment where there could be investment and cooperation. And some of the things that grew out of that were programs like the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Germany, MacArthur's plan, which allowed Japan to rebuild. But what Churchill said on March 5th, 1946, in Fulton, Missouri, with Harry Truman standing right next to him, is his famous Iron Curtain speech. There's an Iron Curtain which has descended in Europe. And the intent of that was to destroy any of the Roosevelt ideas that after the war, not only could we rebuild the enemy's country, Germany, and make them a prosperous, friendly ally, but we could take our most important ally in World War II, the Soviet Union, and maybe bring them into an alliance with us, an economic alliance. And that possibility existed, because if you know anything about World War II, you know that no one paid the price more than the Russians to defeat the Nazis. And in fact, you know that some in the West, including the British and including the Bush family, were involved in promoting the Nazis. So Roosevelt's idea was that we could start with Germany and Japan, but also continue the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union. And Churchill said, absolutely not. This is after Churchill and other Brits had already given a green light to the Russians to move into Eastern Europe. So they created this idea of a two-empire system. And then they used that to say, look, we'd better be careful. We think we just did something great. We got out of a depression, we won a war, but we're threatened with internal communist subversion. The greatest threat to America at the end of World War II, we were told, is communists sneaking into every aspect of our life, taking over our unions, taking over our school systems, taking our children. You know, the invasion of the body snatchers, a prominent movie from the 50s, I think. So Churchill made his speech in 46, and in early 1947, Harry Truman, as president, initiated a loyalty program. Anybody who worked for the federal government had to take a loyalty oath to say that they are not now or have never been a communist. Now, our Constitution guarantees freedom of thought. Now, if someone wants to organize a violent revolution, then we can stop them. But if someone wants to say, I believe in this system or that system, they're entitled to that. Well, not according to Truman, not according to the loyalty oath. And it wasn't just that this was done for federal employees. Very soon, it became a standard that every single university required loyalty oaths. And I just found out a couple of years ago that when they tried to do this at Brooklyn College, where there was a history professor who was a communist, they were trying to run him out. And a handful of professors stood up and defended him, defended his right to be a communist. And one of them was my father, something I never knew about.
Wow.
And fortunately, he didn't get blacklisted, but they ended up firing the communist. Years later, during the free speech movement at Berkeley, and it spread to the rest of the country in 63, 64, there was a man named Herbert Aptheker, who was one of the leaders of the Communist Party in the United States, who was doing a tour of campuses. And they tried to stop him from speaking at Ohio State University, where my father was then a professor. And they asked my father, well, do you think we should protest this rule? And my father said, of course, we should let him speak. I've heard him speak. He's such a boring speaker. He'll never recruit anyone to communism. Let him speak. But Truman didn't just have a loyalty oath. If you wouldn't take the oath, you would not only lose your job, but you would be hunted down. You would be watched by the FBI. And so you couldn't, if you tried to talk to someone, if you went out and said, boy, it's terrible weather today, you might be assuming that you're trying to provoke rebellion by talking about the weather. People became afraid. Now, at the same time, less than 2 weeks later, March 12, 1947, Truman announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine, that the United States was going to fund political parties and illegal activities in Greece, in Turkey, in Italy, and other countries to stop communist takeovers of those countries.
What year was that?
That was in 47, the same, it was 12 days after he did the loyalty oath. And the Truman Doctrine was used to overthrow popular governments, elected governments, including in France, where the communists won a large enough vote that they were included as part of the government. And this kind of activity of the CIA, what became the CIA, undermining governments, not just in South and Central America, the so-called banana republics, but in Europe, continued through the 60s and 70s. The assassination, the kidnapping and assassination of Aldo Moro in 1978 was a NATO CIA operation. And what was the reason they overthrew him? Because he was going to accept what was called the historic compromise of allowing communists to be a part of the government. At that point, they weren't Bolsheviks and Leninists, they were people who were fighting for unions. And instead, the Red Brigades, which was a phony terror operation controlled by NATO and the British, kidnapped Moro, held him for a month or so, and then they dumped his bullet-riddled body in the streets. He was the prime minister, or the president rather, of Italy at the time. Now, as this was unfolding, in October 1947, subpoenas were issued to a large number of Hollywood writers and directors. And the argument was that many of them were communists who were using the movies and their writing to subvert the American democracy and to win people covertly over to communism. Now, many of these people had been members of the Communist Party in the 1930s, because in the 1930s, you had a depression. You had a collapse of the country. You had a potential for a revolution, which was largely stopped by the success of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. But one of the things Roosevelt did, because he wasn't afraid of communism in that way, what Roosevelt said is, we're going to fund education, we're going to fund theater, we're going to fund cultural events. And among the things that were established were theater companies. Now, one which did not receive federal funding, but was set up in New York City, was called the Group Theater. And it had among its members people who had been leftists or communists in the 30s. Now, by the 40s, at the time of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, many of them left the Communist Party because they didn't like the idea of Stalin signing an agreement with Hitler. But once war was declared against the Nazis, these people became great American patriots. And if you go back and look at some of the movies from 43, 44, 45, and some of the Army recruitment films, you'll see how effective they were in promoting the idea that we're going to fight for freedom. So what happened in 47? Well, this was part of the FBI-directed clampdown, not just on these writers, but on anyone that create an environment of fear, because what happened to them? They got called before Congress. There was a congressional committee called the House Un-American Affairs Committee, HUAC. So if you were promoting ideas, you could be considered un-American. This was the early signs of the presidency of George W. Bush, where anyone with an idea is suspicious. So what happened is that they were called before Congress, and they were supposed to testify whether they had been communists, and then once they admitted it, if they had been, who else did they know who were communists? And it was the beginning of compiling lists for blacklisting. And so a lot of the people capitulated and went in and said, yes, but I'm no longer, I've changed. Here are the people I knew who were communists. But there were 10 writers who refused to testify, who pled the Fifth Amendment, who said, I'm not going to answer that question. And they were known as the Hollywood 10. And later, every one of them was sent to prison for a year and fined at least $1,000. More importantly, the movie industry blacklisted them, so they could no longer work again. Now, what else was happening in this period?
Can you name some names of the Hollywood 10?
I don't have the names in front of me. You can just Google it. Dalton Trumbo was one of the most prominent. February 1948, the government of Czechoslovakia collapsed and the communists took over Czechoslovakia. October 1st, 1949, the Mao Zedong and the communists took over the Chinese government. And in June 1950 was the beginning of the Korean War. So in this period, you had an escalation of what the Truman Doctrine had been about, the need to fight internationally against communism and to attack communists in the United States. Now, the methods that were used by the FBI in that period have not changed. There are other examples of just cases you can take. The attack on black elected officials, the so-called Operation Frumenschen, where thousands of black elected officials have been targeted by stings and have been sent to prison for doing things that white politicians always did. You know, we had a case in Houston where a phony contractor was set up, a Hispanic guy, with money to go to the black and Hispanic members of the city council to offer them contributions, and then to say, we'd like you to vote for this project, building a new convention center hotel. Now, all sorts of people were bidding on that hotel who were making contributions. Why did they target the black and Hispanic political elected officials? Because it was the belief that Hoover had that blacks are inherently susceptible to corruption and bribery. So therefore, the FBI and Hispanics later on, and the FBI should therefore go in and bribe them to prove it and then throw them in prison. And this happened to a large number of people, FBI operations, but especially targeting the African American community. There are the famous stories you can look up of Hoover specifically targeting Martin Luther King, with the idea that Martin Luther King was promoting communist ideas, that the people should be treated equally, that there should be universal civil rights. If that's a communist idea, then what happened to our Constitution? Is that a communist document? So the FBI took these kinds of programs. The other one is COINTELPRO, which we're very familiar with because Lyndon LaRouche was targeted going back to 1967-68 by the FBI, where they ran stings, they ran various kinds of things. There was the famous Philadelphia bomb plot, where they supposedly recovered some bomb-making material in the refrigerator of one of our members in Philadelphia, which later turned out to be olive oil, I think, or something like that. But the FBI, meanwhile, had put out a series of reports about how we were preparing to build bombs. This COINTELPRO included such things as the FBI targeting family members of our members, to go to the family members and say, do you know that your son or daughter is a member of a terroristic cult? terrorizing the parents who then put pressure on the children. Again, I can speak personally. Both my father and my wife at the time, Susan Schleinger, her father, were targeted by the FBI and the Anti-Defamation League that worked with them. Her father was an IRS agent. He was persecuting corporations, so he was on the good side of the IRS, trying to get corporations to pay taxes. But imagine a straight arrow IRS guy having 3 FBI officials come into his office and in a loud voice saying, "We need to talk to you about your daughter and son-in-law's involvement with a terroristic organization." And then while people were still in the room, they threw down on his desk pictures of my 1964 red Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser station wagon parked out in front of some building in Brooklyn. And they said, "This car was used to transport guns to black gang members in Brooklyn." Now, do they have a picture of guns in the car? Do they have a picture of me delivering guns? Do they have anything at all to allow for that allegation to be legitimate? But what happened to my father-in-law? He nearly had a heart attack. He became apoplectic. He immediately called us and said, "You'd better get out of that organization. I know what you're doing." And it was years before he told us what had happened. That's the way the FBI works. That they have that ability to terrorize people on college campuses. If you teach the wrong thing, you won't get tenure, you won't keep your job. So when you're looking at the problems that we have today, here we are from the 40s to now, 70-something years. 70 years of this kind of control from the top. The destruction of science, the destruction of understanding history, philosophy, culture. And then on top of that, the iron fist of the FBI telling you you've got to stay within accepted limits when you run for office. Now, I bring up this Ted Cruz thing again, not just because I like to see Ted Cruz suffer, which I do, but someone apparently followed him around and has pictures of him coming in and out of hotels with different women. Now, the only thing that's interesting is the FBI would never do that because they like Ted Cruz. But somebody did. Now, how many congressmen have files on them for illicit sexual activity, whether it's homosexual or heterosexual? How many congressmen have files on them for financial wrongdoing? Again, Ted Cruz got $1.2 million loan from Goldman Sachs, which he inadvertently forgot to report. That was for his Texas Senate race. How can you forget? Goldman Sachs drops $1.2 million on your desk and says, "We want to help you get elected." That was a big part of what he spent on his campaign. How do you forget to report that?
His wife told him to forget.
Yeah, his wife works for Goldman Sachs, or did work for Goldman Sachs. So how many of these people who you see pontificating against Obama, turning red-faced, saying Obama's using executive orders to overturn the Constitution, and not one of them filed a bill of impeachment against him? Why? If he's violating the Constitution and it's costing lives and fortunes, destroying the country, wouldn't you think one of them would have the guts and the decency to file a bill of impeachment? So what if you lose ultimately? You use that as the opportunity to expose what you know. And the fact is you wouldn't lose, because this is a president who has acted repeatedly to put American lives in danger, to destroy nations, using a power that he doesn't have. He's not entitled by the Constitution to conduct warfare against other nations without going to Congress for consent. Yet we did it in Libya. We now have Marines fighting in Iraq and Syria without a war authorization. The United States is an outlaw nation right now because of Obama. And why won't the Republicans bring it up? Because they're saying he's not doing enough to carry out these wars. The Republicans supported what he did in Libya. Now they're going to attack Hillary for it. But when there was an effort in the Congress to stop it, John McCain and Lindsey Graham and others came out and defended Obama's right to destroy the army and the government of Libya. So this is where the FBI conducts operations so that it goes to the people in the institutions, in the Congress, in the judiciary, and blackmails and threatens them. And then it creates an environment where people are afraid to say what they think, or they'll say what they think in a very loud, angry voice, and then you say, okay, will you do something about it? Oh, no, I can't. I don't want to get in trouble. And look, we know this all the time. We talk to lots of people. And most of the people we know now that we talk to have agreed with us that Obama's treasonous. He's just as 8 years ago, people agreed that Bush was treasonous and should be thrown out of office. So you say, well, join us, come to our meeting, come out and deploy with us, help us get out leaflets. Oh, can't do it, can't do it, you'll never win. Why do people think that way? They've been terrorized, and they don't even know it. You know, it's not as though there's a man-eating ape at your door with a machine gun. It's in your mind. That's the way it works. And that's the problem we have. Now, if we know that, then it's our responsibility to free the people of this country from being afraid of that. It's partly why there's so often repeated the phrase from Franklin Roosevelt's first inaugural address: the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Now, it's not wrong to be afraid if you're dealing with a psychopathic fascist killer like Obama. It's not wrong to be afraid that if you get out of line, you might get killed. But do you let that fear keep you submissive to the destruction of the nation? So you don't speak out, you don't act against it. And that's what we have to do. We have to be a voice that gives people a calm sense of what the reality is. And I'll just come back to what I started with. We're in a situation now where, because of the role of China economically, and the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, setting up a new financial system based on investment in physical production, creating productive jobs that will pay wages far above the standard in those countries. That's what we have now, an opportunity to move out of a collapsing financial system into a new paradigm. We have, because of what the Russians did in Syria, a potential to conduct a real war on terror. And who are the terrorists? They're the oligarchs. They're the governments that fund and support ISIS, like the Saudis, like the government of Turkey. We can stop them. We can change it. We can end terrorism. There are governments, as people heard here last week, like Egypt, which is a poor, struggling country. It's struggling because the International Monetary Fund, on behalf of the bankers, imposed policies on the previous regime of Mubarak, which he mistakenly went along with, which impoverished, which kept the country in poverty. But now there's an effort underway to build that country in conjunction with China, to make it a bridge between Asia and North Africa. But what do they face? They face a terrorist insurgency that was partly brought into office by Obama, the Muslim Brotherhood regime. And the Muslim Brotherhood is relatively mild compared to the ISIS and Al-Qaeda forces that are killing people in the Sinai and beheading Egyptians in Libya. So there's a fight going on in the world between, and it's not Muslims and Christians, it's a fight over geopolitics. The religious stuff, when people get caught up in religion, they're just being manipulated by the same kind of FBI tactics. When someone says it's Muslim terrorists, well, what do you think a drone attack is? Is that Christian terrorism? When the United States drones a wedding and kills 15 people who have nothing to do with any terrorists, and then sends another drone 2 hours later to hit the first responders, is that Christian terrorism? It's not a religious terrorism. The terrorism is a tool used by political forces, financial forces, in this case, the forces of the British Empire, against those people who are trying to develop nations. Regime change, 250, 300,000 people killed in Syria. Why? Because of Assad? No, because we funded an insurgency. People who were demonstrating but didn't have weapons suddenly were armed with anti-tank missiles and various lethal weapons. Almost half the people killed in Syria have been Syrian army forces. That goes back to the United States and Obama saying that Assad must go. In Libya, where civilians are killed, you could say it's Islamic jihadists against Islamic moderates, but the whole thing was initiated by Cameron, who's not a Muslim, Sarkozy, who's not a Muslim, and Obama, who's not a Muslim. He's a Satanist. There's a big difference between a Muslim and a Satanist. And that's what we're dealing with here, a satanic force in the world. So we have an opportunity now to clean this up, thanks to what Putin did, thanks to what the Chinese are doing, thanks to what Lynn and Helga Zepp-LaRouche have been doing for the last 30 years to present an alternative. And now with the added initiative here in Texas around the space program, which is largely being directed by Keisha Rogers here, we have an opportunity to inspire young people to become critical thinkers again, as opposed to slaves and zombies to a banking system that's collapsing. So when you put it that way, and then you say to someone, so join us, and they say, well, I've got to play it safe, or I don't have any money. I can't afford to lose my job. My wife will get mad at me if I leave. And what's usually the case? They want to watch a football game or a basketball game or one of these brainwashing series like The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. They're trapped in a brainwashing system. And they're comfortable there because they know if they go outside of it, they might get in trouble. So we just got to tell people that. Don't capitulate to this. Don't belittle. Because there's an effort to make you belittle that's been going on that we can trace back to the beginning of the 20th century with Bertrand Russell and his operation, but then in particular from law enforcement standpoint from Hoover and the FBI in the post-Roosevelt period. And then you can take one further step. Kennedy was fighting it. And they say, yeah, well, look what happened to him. Well, who killed him? The people who want you to sit on your ass and suffer quietly.
Jesus,
thinking it's really important whether you cheer for Duke or North Carolina. So we got to break people out of the littleness. And I go back just finally to what the group theater was trying to do. They were bringing classical drama back to the United States. I did a presentation on Clifford Odets, who's a phenomenal figure who wrote some incredible plays between 1934 and 1938 that were groundbreaking. Time magazine had a picture of him on its cover. When was the last time we had a playwright on the cover of Time magazine? Probably 1937. What was he doing? He was saying to people, you've got to wake up. One of his plays was called Awake and Sing. And his last gasp effort to try and fight was a 1947 or 48 play called The Big Knife. And it starts with a movie actor who's being blackmailed to stay within the studio, within the system. And there are rumors that he's maybe a communist. It's not even clear in the play that he's a free thinker. And the gossip columnist who comes to interview him in the first scene says, well, you always liked FDR. And he said, I did like FDR. So with Odets, it was absolutely clear that he was seeing in real time the way the studios were being used to brainwash and control the population. And what happened to him? After a series of failed plays and disappointments, he ended up testifying before HUAC. And he was a broken man. Never did another good thing after 1948. And that's a case study that I presented at a conference to make this point of how insidious this brainwashing is. And how do you break out of it? Well, if people don't break out of it, we're going to have World War III and a global financial depression far worse than anything we've ever had. So you tell people that, and then you say to them, but we don't have to do it. Work with us. Start reading, start thinking, start coming to meetings, start talking to people. Break out of this environment of fear. And if we do it, we can change the world. So anyway, on this pre-Easter Sunday, I thought I'd give people some hope, because hopefully what the events that you celebrate tomorrow will also be a source of hope. So why don't we take some questions?
What was the John Birch Society and all of that? Were they like a front for the FBI or something like that? The John Birch?
It's really, I mean, they were part of an anti-communist movement. I think they were designed to trap people into impotence, people who knew what was going on. You know, as Lynn always used to call them, the Birch John Society, the Society for the Preservation of Wooden Toilet Seats.
Right.
You know, they're the typical impotent conspiracy theorists. They're going to get you. They control everything. They control your mind. They control the media. They control the food you eat. But if you buy my magic seeds, you can have uncontrolled food. You know, who do you think advertises on these alternative radio stations like Alex Jones? Specialty seeds, clean water, and erectile dysfunction drugs. Because obviously, if you're going to go into a survivalist mode, you want to at least be able to ensure you can have erections while you're dying.
Yeah,
And guns.
that's what they did at the end of Dr. Strange.
Yeah. The last Big Bang.
That's all on tape, all right?
Yeah.
Could you say something about how this continued in the 50s and the 60s? I mean, did the anti-communist thing just morph into the anti-Vietnam radicals? I mean, how did it develop?
Well, it's a long story, and I don't know all the details. But look, what happened in the 50s is you had the McCarthy era, which was the FBI, Roy Cohn, the Joe McCarthy, who was a hack, terrorizing people with the whole argument started as who lost China? Who are the people in the U.S. State Department who didn't let us keep Chiang Kai-shek in power?
They must be communist.
And so,
They must be communist.
Yeah.
That was the one.
well, no, that there was subversion by communists in the military and in the State Department. And that became the McCarthy hearings. And when he started going after the army, Eisenhower came forward along with a few others. Edward R. Murrow, have you no shame. So there was a blowback against it, but anti-communism continued to be the dominant feature. I mean, if you look at the 1960 election, it was over who would be more effective in fighting communism. And Kennedy, unfortunately, used this idea that was being peddled by Henry Kissinger of the missile gap, that not only had the Russians moved ahead of us with Sputnik, but we were behind them in our missile capability. And so Kennedy used that in the election. But once Kennedy became president, I was confronted by the fact that people in his administration, including Hoover and including the head of the CIA, were engaging us in so-called anti-communist activity that could get us into a nuclear war, which Kennedy avoided with the Bay of Pigs. But then within a year, the Cuba Missile Crisis, we could have had a thermonuclear war in October 1962. What was Kennedy's conclusion from that? We'd better deal with this situation with Russia. Let's start deconflicting. Let's open a channel. And the idea also that we don't need a colonial war in Vietnam. And he was told that by Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur. And Kennedy was pulling back from that, and he was killed. And then Malcolm X was killed. People don't always associate the Malcolm X thing with the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King, but it was important because of the way Malcolm X had been evolving. And King, that you saw that same feature with King. When King was killed, what was the great threat with King? Civil rights? No, his argument that civil rights meant economic justice for everyone, including the poorest people in Africa, Asia, and in our own country. And that was subversive. So the anti-communism thing shifted a little bit, and then in the late 60s, it became the other side of it was the British funding to create an anti-war movement that was really not just anti-war, but pro-drug, pro-rock, sex, drug counterculture, which is what affected the boomer
And
generation.
environmentalists.
And became environmentalists, yeah, anti-science to the core. Yeah, Ted?
Yeah, it's, to my thinking, always good to understand where the other guy's coming from. I don't think, you know, you had like the 1930s, you had the Depression, you had basically our system had failed. And you had people wanting to understand at least what the alternatives were, attending Nazi meetings, attending communist meetings, whatever. You had a huge problem with infiltration and with, you know, the Soviet Union itself trying to get as much info out of the United States as they possibly could.
Mhm.
You know, but as everything, you know, the banana file's been released, the KGB archives have been released, as near as I can tell from, you know, I have friends that have studied this stuff, and they tell me that, like, you know, the problem was actually bigger than Joe McCarthy stated, that they don't regard Joe McCarthy as any kind of a hero, so there's a lot of collateral damage. A lot of innocent people were hurt in the whole process. But I don't think that people on the left in this country ever really in those days realized what a problem, you know, what a huge problem the communist system was, even for the people living in it right now.
Mhm.
You know, if you speak Russian decently enough to hear some of these stories or come close enough to it, you know, at times I've spoken with people whose parents have lived under the Tsars, or grandparents have lived under the Tsars. I've always asked them the same question. You know, like, жизнь в России была хуже под коммунизмом или под царями? You know, was life in Russia worse under the Tsars or under the communists? The answer to that one always comes back the same way. So that life under the Tsars was so bad, it never occurred to anybody it could possibly get worse, but guess what? So it didn't just get a little bit worse. So 10 or 12 years after that shit, people would talk about, you know, Tsar's times like the good old days. You know, the Soviet system was capable of producing big things, you know, like hydroelectric dams, like railroads, like buildings. They could not create a consumer economy. Then so it's the little things they totally failed at. There was I'll give you one example, which I think is kind of cute. There was a sausage factory in Moscow, Мясо Kombinata, right, which had gone for 70 years, making sausages out of squirrels and rats and tree bark and dandelions, every kind of thing in the world, you know, grass. But you wouldn't want to eat sausages made up out of. The people screamed and cried, and every time they said anything, act like they could line them all up and shoot them. You know, and
Well, listen, Ted, no one here is defending the Soviet system, but I want to go back to your original premise, because there was an alternative to Nazis and communists, which was Franklin Roosevelt, which was a revival of the American system, and it worked. And Roosevelt was able to do that partly because people were scared if they didn't vote for this, you'd end up with communism or Nazism.
Right.
So what Franklin Roosevelt did in the Depression was revive the American system in a way that gave the United States an opportunity to survive. Now, the problem then was that people saw this argument of, I mean, look, the Soviets were not all that competent in some of the things they were doing to try and subvert the United States. Because when you had progress, when you had economic progress, when the people who are supposed to be the revolutionaries, namely the poor and working class, are starting to have lifting incomes, better salaries, they're not susceptible to the arguments that work for the poor people in Tsarist Russia of peace, bread, and land, you know, which was part of the Leninist strategy.
Yeah, millions of people killed. Okay, you had like an artificial famine in Ukraine, killed like 10 or 12 million people. It was they call Holodomor, you know, like death by hunger, right? You had like all kinds.
But there's no question about that. You see, the problem is that when your straw man of the left was never really cognizant of that, some of the worst forms of destruction were conducted by so-called left Democrats in the name of anti-communism. People like Scoop Jackson, he wasn't really a leftist, but the efforts to destroy the potential for détente. And Franklin Roosevelt was confident enough that the US came out of World War II strong, that we could negotiate with Stalin and say to him, not that we love your system and we want it here, but you should look at what we did and we'll look at what you did, and we should work together in a way that's not ideological, but toward the mutual interests of all peoples. And that was shut down by Truman.
It was against the British.
That was shut down by Truman, who was operating on behalf of the British. So you can't fall into the left-right gang, counter-gang, because that's how people end up. Were there some people who were soft on communism in the State Department? Probably. Is that why China got taken over by Mao? Absolutely not. China got taken over by Mao because the people running the movement, the Shanghai Sheks movement, were the ones who were honest were undercut at every stage by the British. It was British operations that was oriented toward destroying the Chinese nationalists. So the split was the right one.
Well, the
FDR
British
versus
trying
the
to achieve
Brits.
a communist system in China, or what?
Was there what?
Were the British trying to achieve a communist system in China, or what?
They just wanted to keep China backward and controllable.
Bertrand Russell.
Look, the British played a big role in the Bolshevik Revolution. And just as you say that people became nostalgic for Tsarist times during the communist period, in the post-communist period, because of the British, people became nostalgic for communism during the Yeltsin period. And luckily, instead of getting communism, they got Putin.
Yeah, that's very fortunate.
Yeah.
Vladimir Putin's the best ruler they've ever had since our Peter.
Absolutely. Yeah, let me take some other questions. Yeah, did you have a question?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, I thought your hand was up.
I wanted to go back to the period before and the movie industry that you were speaking on.
Yeah.
You say the FBI infiltrated and influenced, dominated the movie industry. I think you said after, in the 40s or after.
Well, it was after the 47, 48, after the Hollywood 10.
So what was it, say, the comparison, what was Hollywood, objective, or what the direction they was going in before the infiltration of the FBI?
You see, this is the interesting thing. They weren't producing communist propaganda films that were just mildly disguised. You can take an example, the It's a Wonderful Life, Frank Capra. That was an attack on Wall Street. He was attacking Wall Street in favor of the idea of savings and loans that enabled people to build houses. The famous story of George Bailey, and I don't know if you're familiar with that one. But, Hollywood was not a hotbed of communist propaganda. But by attacking people who may have been communists who were working there, it had a bigger effect on suppressing a discussion, suppressing ideas, a dialogue. And so if you look at the movies in the 50s, what do we mainly remember? Davy Crockett, Westerns, just pablum. There was a period of a total vacuum of ideas.
His name Wayne.
John Wayne.
John
Look,
Wayne.
one of the interesting things, when there were the attacks on the Hollywood 10, Ronald Reagan at the time was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. And he was put under enormous pressure to side with the studios against the writers. And he eventually did, and this was supposedly a big source of tension between himself and his wife at the time, who was friends with people who were being attacked. Give you another example how this worked. Richard Nixon's election to the US Senate. He ran against someone named Helen DeHagen Douglas, who is the wife of Melvyn Douglas, who was a very prominent actor. But Melvyn Douglas had given some money to communist causes. And so Nixon's campaign to get his first Senate seat was largely a campaign against the communists who were trying to take over the Senate through Helen DeHagen Douglas. So it was a promotion of this kind of fear tactic. So it wasn't so much what Hollywood was doing. It's that there were people in Hollywood who believed that there should be a higher discussion of ideas, who were trying to get film to be more of a to produce tragic dramas that get people to think, which is what they were doing with the plays in the 30s. A lot of the people from the group theater and places like that were writing these dramas modeled on the works of Schiller and Lessing that were or Shakespeare, that were tragedies to cause an audience to recognize that they have to do something. I'll just give you, this is a long answer, but I'll give you an example. Clifford Odets' first play that was prominent was called Waiting for Lefty. It took place as there was a taxi strike, an actual taxi strike in New York City. So he wrote a play about the taxi drivers who were trying to go on strike. And what they were waiting to start the strike, what were they waiting for? They were waiting for their boss, the head union guy, Lefty, to show up. And while this is going on, they're getting into arguments and fights and all kinds of things are happening. And the energy that should go into planning the strike was lost. And then someone comes and says, Lefty was shot last night, he's dead. And so what happens then? Does the union disband? Well, one union guy starts chanting, strike, strike, strike. And it was such a powerful drama, the audience started chanting that. Now, this was an incredible change because the thing that Kloerman and Odets and others were trying to do was, how do you create a culture where you can communicate to people they should be active, that they're not just sitting there, stoned out of their mind watching something fantasy-ridden on the screen, but that you actually have a drama that engages their mind and says to them, you must do something. So you actually get the audience suddenly thinking, yeah, don't wait for someone, you yourself have to do it. That's what Odets' idea was. So he said, look, if we can do this with audiences of 200 at a theater, imagine the potential if we could make films that accomplish this, that bring Schillerian tragic drama to life for the American people. That's what they didn't want. And it never really happened in Hollywood because the film industry was controlled by people who were essentially like Walt Disney, who was part of the right wing. So the FBI operation was designed to prevent that from ever happening. So does that give you a better sense of?
Yeah, because I remember some movies in that period, and they were kind of, I would just say, inspiring. But the movies today, the comparison, which I never really looked at, like the way
today you just go to be entertained, to see something that you can chat with people about the next day at work, whether it's how many naked women were there, or the great computer animations and things of that sort. Yeah, special effects. Yeah, but the idea that there's an idea content. There are a few movies like The Big Short, but they did it in such a way that it wasn't as clear as it could be, that we all got cheated by a bunch of swindlers on Wall Street in 2008. Now, the punchline at the end is they say, and after this crash occurred, everything was done to change the system so it wouldn't happen again. And then comes up on the screen and says, no, it didn't.
Right.
So, you at least leave knowing that you were screwed then and you're still being screwed. But does it give you an impetus to want to do something about it? And that's the difference between real tragic drama, classical tragedy, and just good storytelling. I mean, there are some good storytellers who make movies, who are sophisticated and can do some things. And there are some movies that move people. You think some people thought Braveheart was a movie that inspired you to want to fight for the right, but no one knows what the hell the whole story was about. That never really came through.
What movie was that you said?
Braveheart. Ian and then Craig, and I'll get back to you, Ted. No.
So, when I was growing up, my familiarity with the FBI was through things like the X-Files, and then books like Red Dragon or Silence of the Lambs, where agents were going in there to find serial killers and other horrible people, which I found kind of inspiring. And then after 9/11 happened, we started hearing about, okay, they're going after your library records. Now you have the NSA with all the stuff that came out of Snowden. You know, we have all these reports about the CIA doing dirty operations all over the world, including coups and other things. You know, there's that book about the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, right? Going into this total collusion between. It says, I mean, for
The police state or the deep
you
state,
single out the FBI, but it's sort of like, okay, well, there's all these other things involved too, and maybe the Department of Homeland Security and some of these other groups. But so when you have such what appears to be like a really involved and entrenched kind of thing, that on some level, okay, there might actually be a need to have something like that, and a real intelligence capability for home and abroad. How would you go about reforming that or getting rid of this problem, which is this corruption in the justice state and other departments? How do you actually fix this problem? I mean, just talking about it is one thing. Like, okay, we have some congressional hearings, or how do you? I mean,
well, yeah, they tried that. There were the church committee hearings that said the CIA can't do certain things. They're doing all the things they were told they're not allowed to do by the church committee, including committing assassinations. One of the things that came out of the church committee hearings was that it became the law that presidents cannot order assassinations. Obama is now ordering assassinations. So what happened to that? You can't do it by reforming the institution. You have to go to the top. You have to have a president who has a different approach, and that approach has to be the one that Lynn is talking about in the American system. If you recruit people to an agency on the narrow basis and say, you got to be honest, you got to be clean, and you got to go out and find bad guys, and then they find out that the agency itself is colluding in corruption and immoral activity like Fast and Furious, providing guns to Mexican drug runners. What does that do to the morale of the good people in an agency? So you have to go to the top. What is the intention of our national policy? What is the national mission? And this is why Kennedy was quoted as saying to one of his colleagues, we have to bust the CIA up into 1,000 pieces. He was going to start over because the CIA from the beginning was, with the OSS, you had a group of people around Bill Donovan who were with Franklin Roosevelt. But then you had a whole other group that were the Acheson, Harriman, Bush crowd that wanted to use the power of the US government for their own special private interests. So the key is, how do you shift from having a government that defends private interests to a government that acts for the benefit and welfare of the people? So if you make that kind of change, then you bring in an FBI director who goes through top to bottom to make sure he gets people in there who are the people that will do that. But if you don't have that at the top, you can get a reformer into the FBI and he's not going to do anything. He's not going to be able to. Betty was next.
Yeah, I remember the FBI was involved in a lot of the local control, promoting voting movements, or local control and other stuff.
Well, let me give you an example. In 1976, I was in Charlotte, North Carolina. We were organizing in Greensboro. And one of the people who was interested in meeting with us, I found out later from Freedom of Information Act, was an FBI informant. And I also found out that he was the Grand Dragon of the Klan in that area. Now, so the Grand Dragon of the Klan was working for the FBI. Now, when I first met him, I thought he was a contact who was interested in our ideas. And in my first meeting with him, which is the way I found out about his FBI connection, because it was, he and I were meeting alone, and there was a report about the meeting in the FBI files. What he did say to me is that, look, Klan guys are going to attack your rally in downtown Greensboro tomorrow. So I'm going to try and stop it. And I said, well, how are you going to stop it? You're going to come out with us? And he said, no, I'm going to talk to the people I know in the Klan. And I said, you know people in the Klan? And he said, well, I'm the Grand Kleagle or something like that.
You didn't mind sharing that with you?
Well, maybe he was trying to keep a bigger operation in place because 2 years later, some of you may remember this, there was a shootout in Greensboro between the Revolutionary Communist Party and the Klan where 6 people were killed. So there may have been a bigger operation. We were in the way of that, and he didn't want his group getting involved in beating up our people. I don't know exactly what his role was, but I'm just using as an example that the Klan almost ceased to exist in North Carolina in the late 60s, early 70s, or the mid to late 60s. And then they used a bus bombing in Detroit during the busing and the anti-busing activity in Charlotte to rebuild the Klan. But who was rebuilding? It was FBI agents. So in answering Betty's question, the FBI was infiltrating organizations, including the Black Panther Party, where you had people who were really trying to protect people in the African American community and do certain things. And then you had people who came in and said, no, it's all about us having guns. Let's get guns and kill some pigs. And so you have movements that might be legitimate movements that are directed in a way that's self-destructive. And that's the kind of stuff the FBI has always done.
So related to that, the intent then of the FBI, besides gathering intelligence and infiltrating these organizations, was to perpetuate them and actually expand them. For what reasons, if that's true?
If you think about what is it that's done by these kinds of agencies, who are they working for? They're working to keep the population from having a real discussion, from actually acting on principles and mobilizing. So their intent is not just to keep an eye on them, but to direct them in ways that are self-feeding of the need for an FBI. Now, I'll give you another case study that I know. Remember the Waco situation around David Koresh and the Branch Davidians? The ATF was coming up for being shut down because people said, why do we need alcohol, tobacco, and firearms? So they were looking for an opportunity to show how they're protecting the community from gun-wielding cults. And so what did they do? They actually went in and shot up people who, if they really wanted to talk to David Koresh, the sheriff of the county there in Waco said he could have brought Koresh in for a discussion. Instead, they show up with guns and people inside started shooting. So, and what was the outcome of that? We need the ATF to protect us. So these kinds of things are typical. But go back to Ian's question. What's the intent? To keep power concentrated in the hands of a group of swindlers and speculators and private interests, and to do everything possible to prevent a movement that targets them from coming into existence. And they saw Lyndon LaRouche when we had a group of 20 people working with him at Columbia University. They saw him as a threat, and that's why they mobilized to try and shut him down.
Can you mention something a bit about the Prohibition era and the role of the FBI and the role of having prohibition?
Well, prohibition was a silly idea, but what was done with was used to build the FBI. The FBI never really cracked down on the families that were doing this, like the Bronfman family was bringing English whiskey through Canada. The Jacobs family. Joe Kennedy, that's how he was making money. The so-called Italian mob or the Jewish mob of New Jersey, the Reinfeldt syndicate. These were all infiltrated by the FBI, and they let them kill and pillage, and every once in a while they'd go for a big arrest. But what it did was it made sure that there was an organized crime operation that they were cognizant of and working with. Hoover used to go to the track with some of the members of these prohibition gangs, these alcoholic running gangs. And I can't remember Arnold Flegenheimer, Dutch Schultz, and his guys used to go Hoover and give him money to play the horses. So yeah, he knew organized crime. They were his buddies. They probably did cross-dressing together at night.
But what was the purpose of prohibition? I mean, it wasn't just to get people to stop drinking.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's a much, you should research that. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, I think, had a deeper intent.
But then the FBI was moving in on, you know.
Yeah, but
Louise,
it's really kind of a diverging.
It is, okay, yeah.
Yeah, Craig and Ted, then we'll stop.
Could you say something about our effective joke campaign against the FBI and what their response was?
Well, look, what Lynn said is you got to let them know that we know what they're doing. So we started putting out cartoons about Agent Fosdick, or Fuzzdick, which was a character who's usually a flasher in a raincoat with an FBI badge. And, you know, how do you know the FBI's been at your house? Your garbage cans are turned over and your dog's pregnant. You know, we just ridicule the idea that this is a law enforcement agency. And in order to do it, in order to give people the confidence that we shouldn't just be afraid of these guys, that they're an illicit operation, and that we're onto them. That was the main point. And they knew very well what we were doing. And the idea was to go directly at them. You know, I told people earlier, we had a thing that we did in North Carolina. How do you tell the FBI agents in the Klan? They're the ones that stain the sheets. So.
But the holes in the sheets are in the back.
Well, that was the other joke. In any case, the idea was that you got people to laugh at the fact that they were being manipulated by the FBI. And in fact, there was a guy who attacked, we had a Senate campaign in 1974 where it was attacked by people at this tobacco plant who said they were with the Klan. And we had a picture of one of the guys. And we posted that picture of him attacking us, saying that this guy is on drugs and dangerous and works for the FBI. And we distributed it at the plant, but also in his neighborhood. And we went to his house, and the woman came running out and said, "This is my stepson, and you're absolutely right about him." So, you know, the idea was to get the upper hand psychologically, as opposed to being terrified by these guys. Yeah, Ted, we'll take one more.
Yeah, about Hollywood again. Where does this anti-Christian bias come from? I mean, you look at things like Inherit the Wind or Carrie or Stephen King and his movies, The Mist. I mean, it seems like there's an awful lot of it.
It's part of the culture. Look, you have a lot of that goes back to Aldous Huxley. It goes back to the British invasion in the 30s that came in and basically wanted to push the drug culture. And so one of the ways they did it was through this idea that there's nothing special about man, that the only thing that we really are a creature of experience and sensation, and therefore there's no higher impulse or godlike quality that exists in human beings.
So that's not like some kind of an organization or something in Hollywood? Or...
No, it's the culture. You create a culture of that. There are people pushing it who do come largely from British intelligence. You look at, there's some biographies of Aldous Huxley and his role in going into Hollywood in the 30s and spreading LSD culture, which later in the 50s and 60s, the Easy Rider and things of that sort. So, but it's people who are trying to figure out how do you degrade what could be culture into a medium for control. So that instead of culture being used to give people a sense of their divine capabilities and the capacity of man, it just becomes part of a miasma of an entertainment experience. And so then you have it for different sorts. You have pro-Christian, anti-Christian. You have some that are explicit and some that are much more clever in the way they do it. Like, for one thing, you may not think much about this when I first say it, but think about it. What does it do for children when they see animals with feelings and that can talk, like the Disney cartoons? When you start identifying animals as humans, and then the humans are worse than the animals in the cartoons. Did you want to ask another question? Yeah, go ahead.
Something you said earlier, but what I was thinking is like we hear it's flashed across the news that like a terrorist person or organization here in this country, the FBI arrested or through surveillance and tracking, was attempting to blow up a building or a bomb or whatever what you would do. But sometimes I get the feeling that these guys are like guinea pig. They're being set up. Like they're actually working for the FBI, but they don't know it. Or they're victims of an FBI sting or plot. They're pulled into a plot to play a part.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. There are a number of cases where the big exposure, bomb plot uncovered by FBI in such and such a place. And they write about people who were building bombs, and you find out when the story actually comes out that the people had no idea how to build a bomb. The FBI was the one who gave them the directions for the bombs and was showing them where to get the fertilizer or the components. A lot of these, where they'll find people who might make a statement like, I hate the U.S., I want to destroy the U.S., they go in and they befriend them. They become part of a cell with them. Look, here's the funny thing. The argument that's used by the defenders of the Cheney national security model is we haven't had it, they say until recently, we haven't had terrorist attacks in the United States because of the effective work that's being done by the intelligence agencies. Well, maybe it's just that there aren't that many terrorists in the United States. Maybe it's also that people in the Muslim community are coming forward and singling out people, and there is effective law enforcement to watch them. There was an interesting story, one of these bomb makers in Belgium. His family went to the police and said, look, our son went to Syria and he came back talking about bombs and killing people. And the Belgian police noted that and never did anything about it. So maybe there is some competent law enforcement work, or maybe there's not that big a threat. But if we're depending on the FBI to protect us, the actual danger comes from the fact that our foreign policy is creating terrorists. When we go in and drone a wedding, everyone who's connected to the wedding party as a family starts to hate the United States. Our policy in the Middle East of overthrowing Saddam, overthrowing Gaddafi, trying to overthrow Assad, where we took relatively stable societies and turned them into Darwinian jungles, that creates anti-American sentiment. So it's our policy which actually has been taking people who are left out and who are perhaps imperfect people with psychological problems, it gives them an incentive to come and get us. And so, again, if you want to address it, instead of doing it on the law enforcement level, address it at the foreign policy and strategic level. Suppose we help now to rebuild Syria. People there who might otherwise be anti-American might say, well, look, America did help us. So that's the whole idea of getting to this new paradigm with these development projects. I know Keisha wants to say something before we finish.
No, I was waiting.
All right, well, but what we've got to do is we've got to take these ideas out to people, get people involved. And every Saturday we have these meetings. We're going to have another concert coming up soon. And it's important that people overcome their fear of discussing these kinds of ideas.
April 7th.
Oh, and then on April 7th, we're having a major conference in New York City. We just had a conference in Cairo, Egypt, where the Ministry of Transportation invited the editor of the Arabic language EIR to give a presentation on the Silk Road. We had a conference in Yemen, where the Saudis are bombing the country into the dark ages, and a LaRouche supporter in Yemen held a very prominent press conference. Now, if you want to talk about someone who's not afraid, imagine Yemen, which has been torn apart by this US, British, Saudi-directed civil war, having a press conference supporting LaRouche's idea of the new Bretton Woods, of the land bridge and bringing the Chinese in.
Yeah.
So we're doing this around the world. Helga was in India. She was in China. We had a conference in Frankfurt, which was addressed by the Ethiopian government on last Wednesday. So this is what we're doing. And people should join us, should become a part of the movement, and take these ideas and bring them to the general population so they have something other than bad presidential campaigns and stupid sports events to talk about.
I think it's also a testament to the importance of a positive culture that the person in Yemen who sought us out, you know, through the internet and became part of our movement and has the courage to do this and organize a regular institutional reading of our report is the leading poet.
He's a poet.
in
Yeah.
Yemen.
Yeah.
But less than 20 pages is proof that the FBI is not interested in
Yes.
stopping terrorism.
That's a very good point. Yeah, the fact that the FBI has hidden the evidence of the Saudi role in 9/11 and that Bush and Obama have continued to keep that hidden, that's further evidence of the FBI corruption and terror.
Plus their role in the cover-up on the Kennedy assassination.
Right, right. And I was just gonna say just one final thing too, just to remember what what you just gave us, as you said, a case study. That was just one case of the FBI's involvement. You can look at it from the standpoint of the music industry, of what the scientific community, and there's a lot on, you know, the attacks on NASA, the attacks that even Einstein himself was actually exposing in terms of the threats and the fears that amongst the scientific community being able to do the work and breakthroughs that they were needing to make. So, but then I thought about it, just that it's important to go back to Mr. LaRouche's understanding of this coming out of the, you brought this up earlier, coming out of the World War II period. You know, what was happening after he was warding himself at 94, you know, being in World War II.
It's only 93.
93? Oh.
Making him older.
After the death of President Franklin Roosevelt, what happened to the culture and the population? You had a population that went in that were fighters ready to fight for the nation, that came out and were like, as he said, you know, oh, you know, you don't say the wrong things, don't hang around the wrong people. You got to do as you're told and be quiet. So it gets a whole lot deeper in that aspect in terms of the attack.
See, my father was a perfect example of that. He stood up in 1948 to defend someone's right to teach without being subjected to loyalty oaths. And then 20 years later, he wouldn't talk politics. So we'll end with that and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harvey.